Father in heaven, Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to open your word. And we ask for the special blessing of your Spirit, that, Lord, you may confirm us in these things, and that we may come away with greater strength and greater knowledge of this increase of knowledge that you're opening to our understanding. Please guide us, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, good evening again. Now, as was communicated in the email, the subject that I'll be covering today is a document. I'll be doing a review of a document that Elder Tess had shared in some of her recent meetings. I don't think not this camp, but a previous one. And the document is How the Constitution Became Christian by Jared A. Goldstein. Could I get a feel for who has read this document, or who is reading it, who has considered it? Feel free to open up your mic and say if you're familiar with it, or to post in the chat. Okay, so Alison, you say you're reading it now. Has anyone else looked at it, or was it completely new?
I've also gone over it with the SAC Central group as well. So yeah, they've gone over it, and I'm reading it secondly now.
Sounds great. Okay, David, you're still reading it? Okay. So at least some of us are familiar with it. It might be useful. Let me see if I can post it in the chat. Marka, you say you've listened to presentations on it. All right, let me post it to the chat. There we go. So it's uploaded to the chat. Now, this is a version with my highlights in it. But in any case, for those who haven't read it, it's a very worthwhile document to read. And Isabel, I say you've been reading portions and shared with some friends. Amen. Yeah, it's a lot of important insights that it presents. The document is still uploading, but it will get there eventually. In the chat, you'll see it posted, so you can download for those who don't have it. So what is this document about? I'm going to share my screen because we'll be going through the document, and I have a diagram, a line that I've put together to accompany the document. So I'll share my screen shortly. But for a bit of background on the document itself, remembering that, this is not a lecture. Feel free to chime in at any point if you have a thought or a question or a contribution, whichever way, right? So a little bit of background on the document itself, right? How the Constitution Became Christian is a research paper that was written by Jared A. Goldstein under the Roger Williams University's School of Law and Legal Studies. And Goldstein is a teacher of constitutional law, right? He is also distinguished as being one of the first civilian lawyers allowed into the Guantanamo Bay prison, in conjunction with his representation of several families of Kuwaiti detainees. So he's not just a constitutional lawyer and a teacher of constitutional law. We do see that he is of notable merit for other things that he's done. He was the first civilian lawyer allowed into Guantanamo Bay to represent some of the detainees there. So he prepared this paper, How the Constitution Became Christian, and he's prepared other useful and interesting papers. But for tonight, we will consider this one. So what is he talking about in this document? What is he covering in this document? Before we discuss that, so what is the point of the document? What is he covering? It would be useful to place our consideration of this document within its prophetic context, within our prophetic context. I hope that makes sense. Before we delve into the document itself, it would be useful to locate it within our prophetic context. Okay, I've just been told I sent the document to Katya rather than everyone, so I'm going to try to resend it again. Try to send it to everyone this time. Okay, so it's uploading. You should receive it shortly. So I was talking about the prophetic context for our consideration of this document. Here's where I share my screen. Here we go, the prophetic context. So it's something that has been spoken of in recent meetings, and it received mention in this camp meeting that's just come to a close, that we're in the increase of knowledge for the Sunday law, right? That is what is represented in this top line. Hope you can see my arrow. The line, the 144,000, where do we stand? We are post 9/11 and we are approaching the Sunday law, but we're in the increase of knowledge for the Sunday law. Right now, we're receiving an increase of knowledge. The information that is being opened up to our understanding now is relating to what is our Sunday law issue for this dispensation. So there are a number of ways we could look at that. We could view where we stand from the perspective of the line of the 144,000, or we could view it from the perspective of the line of the priests. So when we look at the line of the priests, we're in this 2019 to 2021 dispensation, okay? And we have discussed the prophetic pattern that we see in all these dispensations. In all four of these dispensations, there's a pattern, Boston, Concord, Exeter test, right? That we see repeated in each one of them, where there's a message unsealed. There's an increase of knowledge on that message. That message is formalized, leading to a test. Okay, so when we look at where we are presently, we're in this 2019 to 2021 dispensation. And where we are within this 2021 dispensation, depending on the lens through which you view it, this is the harvest. We're in the harvest of the priests. But when we view where we are through the lens of the prophetic pattern that is repeated in each dispensation, we are in the increase of knowledge. We mark the increase of knowledge specifically for this dispensation, specifically from May to September of last year. And the light that was opened up in this time was the APIS bull study, right? So we have the APIS bull study being opened up from May to September last year in the increase of knowledge. of the harvest dispensation of the priests, but where this is also the increase of knowledge for the Sunday law, more broadly speaking. Okay, so that's the point made in this top bullet, that this increase of knowledge in the history of the priests is also part of the increase of knowledge on the Sunday law waymark in the line of the 144,000. And so we're receiving an increase of knowledge, the increase of knowledge on the Sunday law. And this increase of knowledge is couched in the study of the Apis bull. But what was the Apis bull study setting forth? What does it set forth? Right? What is it communicating? There are a number of ways you could frame it, but we want to state it in summary fashion here, which is that when you look at ancient Israel, you see three dispensations in the history of ancient Israel. Those dispensations are Moses, Babylon, and Rome. And you see that God, he initiated a reformatory movement to lead them out of they were in Egyptian captivity, they were in darkness and in idolatry in Egypt. God initiated a reformatory movement to lead them out of that darkness. But we see that
Elder Thibault, you're breaking up.
They let go of their idolatry that they in their that was. Can you hear me now?
Can you speak?
Can you hear me?
Yes. You'll have to repeat what you had said. We lost most of what you were saying just a few minutes ago.
Okay. Let me know immediately if I'm breaking up. All right. So I was saying the increase of knowledge that is being opened up to us, right? When an increase of knowledge at present, right? An increase of knowledge on the Sunday law, and this increase of knowledge is coming through in the form of this study on the Apis bull. And what is the study of the Apis bull setting forth? In summary fashion, we see that in the beginning of their history, in their time of darkness, God's people were involved in idolatry. And we see God's efforts over 3 dispensations to bring them out of that idolatry. But we see that, they failed to overcome it. They didn't let go of it. And that's what eventually led to their destruction in the time of Rome. Okay, so, right, we saw the worship of the Apis bull being manifest at the golden calf apostasy in Sinai. Right, they held to the form and the spirit or the mindset of their idolatry. They went into Babylonian captivity, and God led a reformatory movement to bring them out of Babylon. And they learned well enough to leave off the form, but they held on to the mindset or the spirit of the idolatry that they had held on to all the way back from Egypt. And it was that mindset, by the time that Christ came, it was that mindset that prevented them from recognizing him and receiving him. So we see this pattern over these 3 dispensations of ancient Israel. And we see a similar pattern in modern Israel, where there is idolatry that we can trace back to the captivity, to the dark ages. Right? And just like ancient Israel, it is God's failure to recognize, to address, to overcome this idolatry that leads them now in the dispensation of the 144,000 to fail and to ultimately be lost, right? So how do we protect ourselves? How do we insulate ourselves? It's by going back into the time of darkness, into the time of captivity, and identifying what the issues were, what the darkness is, what the idolatry is in the context of this line, and tracing it through from the Millerite time period through to early Adventist history, through to our dispensation. So we know what the issues are that we need to watch out for, essentially. The issues that we were born into by virtue of our heritage, right? But that if we don't recognize them and address them, we will fail ultimately in accomplishing the work God seeks to accomplish through us in this dispensation. So that is the prophetic context, right? This Apis Bull study, we've been going back into the history of the time of the end, 1798, and the history preceding it. And we've been identifying the idolatry, the issues, the dogma, that's been taken from Protestantism. And we've been tracing it through to the present. That's what the various studies that have been conducted over the last few camps have been doing. They've been covering this history. So now we come to this document, How the Constitution Became Christian by Jared Goldstein. And what this document is doing is it is another piece of the puzzle. It is filling in that picture. It is fleshing out that picture of that history that we're threading through, the history of idolatry that we're tracing from the time of the end, America's early history, late from the late 18th century through to the 19th and 20th centuries, bring us to the present. This document is filling in, is fleshing out that we are painting, right? That we are tracing through from the 1700s through to the present. So I hope that makes sense. Do you have any questions or thoughts on the context so far? Do we have any thoughts, questions, or points on the context for our consideration of this document?
What do you think?
Yes, Claudia, I see your mic is open.
Yeah, what do you think about the difference between the Egypt captivity that it seems like is the King of the South type of captivity and the Dark Ages that it seems like a church and state with the church in command, the King of the North type of Sunday law? There is any difference that we can draw from these two types of captivities?
Okay, so you're asking the question that what is the difference between the captivity in Egypt, which you're likening to a King of the North style captivity, and a Sunday law, the king and the captivity. And I'm not too, I mean, I'd have to think about that particular parallel that you're making, where you're identifying the captivity in Egypt as akin to the king of the north, and the captivity of the Dark Ages as akin to the king of the south. In what sense would you say that is so? If you would mind elaborating on that point. I don't think I've heard that.
Jonathan is saying that the Egypt was not, we cannot compare it with the king of the south. But I was doing this, I was making this question because you were saying we have to understand what was before so we cannot make the mistake when at our time. That's what I was reflecting.
Okay. I think the main lesson is, if I take a look at the chat, what's being posted. Katya saying she thinks it's the contrary. King of the South is Egypt, King of the North is the papacy. Okay. I think the main lesson, you know, from this parallel, from this compare and contrast of these two histories, is that the nature of the idolatry is contextual, right? The nature of the idolatry is contextual. I think that's the main takeaway that we need to come away with, because when we look at the Egyptian captivity, we look at that history, we see the paganistic idolatry, of course, that they imbibed and that they really never let go of right up until Christ came, and which eventually sunk them. Now, when we look at modern Israel, we know that ancient Israel is giving us a template, is giving us a model. It's our counterpart, right? But we know that there are differences in that the issue in the history of modern Israel is not paganistic idolatry in the sense of in the sense that it was in Egypt. We must look to the context of this history and the issues of this history to identify what is the issue. It's not exactly the same thing. It's defined by the context within which, by the context of this history. It's defined by the context of the history of modern Israel. Right. So when we come to modern Israel, we're not looking for idolatry that is, the same as that which existed in Egypt. We're looking for something specific to this history and the characteristics of this dispensation, if we view modern Israel as a dispensation. It's a basic thought, but it's the I think it's the thought that needs to be understood when seeking to identify what is the idolatry that we are looking to see and trace through to the present. So Davy says the idolatry in Egypt was open, blatant. The idolatry went underground, hidden in later contexts, later dispensations. Babylon, then Rome, more dangerous because it's internal and not external. It's a mindset and a heart issue. It's harder to eradicate. And I think
that makes sense.
Yes,
that makes sense for me. Yes. I think that makes sense.
It does, yeah. Yeah, it makes sense to me too. Okay. So those are just a few points on the context of our consideration of this document. Now, if we move to the document itself, right? how I'd like to approach it is if we could share the reading, right? These Thursday studies are participatory. I'll ask that we participate. Let's share the reading. They're just some highlighted portions that I want us to read and that we will share commentary on. And the hope is to eventually come to a point where we can populate this line. We can populate this line because really what this entire document is presenting is the history of these three dispensations that we see laid out in this diagram. Sorry, let me show you the diagram I'm referring to. New share. This is the diagram I'm referring to, right? We want to populate this diagram because these three dispensations that we see, these three histories are the histories covered in this document. And there's a pattern that we see in these three histories. And this is the pattern that is the subject of Goldstein's that's the subject of Goldstein's study of his document. Okay. So we come back to the document. And again, the document that I sent you has these yellow portions, which are just my highlights. I'll begin by reading this first portion, and then I'll engage someone else to continue as we go. So Goldstein says, as this article begins to show, the relationship between the Constitution and national identity is quite different than conventional wisdom suggests. Rather than defining what it means to be American, the Constitution has been the battleground on which disputes over national identity are fought. In the nation's countless conflicts over national identity, the Constitution has served as a magic mirror upon which we gaze and see ourselves. Some find in the Constitution confirmation that the nation is committed to a set of universal ideals, though what those ideals consist of depends on the viewer. Libertarians read a libertarian constitution, while progressives read a progressive constitution. Others find in the Constitution confirmation that the nation is defined by race, ethnicity, and religion. Nativists read a nativist constitution, while white supremacists read a white constitution. And this is an interesting phenomena that we see in contemporary political discourse, because there are various narratives and there are various lines of thought, there are various ideologies that are at play. Okay, you have I think, most vocal now, most popular now, or rather the issue that has been given special attention now are these nativist voices, right, who view the United States as a white Christian nation that was made for white Christians, or to be specific, white Christian men. And they read the Constitution that way, and they're able to cry, not weak arguments for that, right? That, the Constitution reflects their ideology in that respect, and that those who have come and who view it differently, view the Constitution as more inclusive, are revisionists who are perverting the Constitution from its original purpose, right? Then, of course, you have those progressive thinkers who view the Constitution as really as the opposite, as setting forth how shall I say it, as an inclusive document, right? Upholding the equality of all peoples, upholding the equality of all Americans, right? And not presenting any religious tests. In fact, it's an irreligious document, essentially. And as has also been pointed out, you have the libertarians who view the Constitution as presenting really their ideology also. So it's really like a magic mirror where people see themselves, right? And it becomes significant because the Constitution then becomes the battleground over which these various identities and ideologies fight for recognition, fight for primacy of place. The Constitution becomes the battleground and the claim of all of them, right? So continuing on, it says, this article illustrates the dynamics that transform conflicts over national identity into constitutional conflicts by examining 3 episodes in the long-standing dispute over whether the United States is a Christian nation. This is a peculiar phenomenon because other countries have had conflicts over national identity, over conservatism and liberalism, over nationalism as defined by, one political sect versus a nationalism as defined by another political sect, and I'm from a country where you do see this taking place, right? A conflict between nationalists and progressives. But the Constitution, the nation's Constitution, does not figure largely in that debate, right? It is a peculiarity of, the American theater of conflict over national identity. It is a peculiarity of the American theater that their Constitution becomes the battleground over which these fights over identity are fought, over which these battles over identity are fought. So we read that this article illustrates the dynamics that transform conflicts over national identity into constitutional conflicts by examining 3 episodes in the long-standing dispute over whether the United States is a Christian nation. The first part of this document looks at the 19th century movement to amend the Constitution to proclaim national devotion to Jesus Christ. When we come to this 19th century movement, what 19th century movement is it referring to? Maybe we'll come to that. Okay, just for time. The Great Awakening. It was not the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is not the movement being referenced here. This movement was definitely, I don't know if you could say it was influenced or came out of the Great Awakening. I don't know if you could say that, but it was not the Great Awakening specifically, right? Katya got it, the NRA, the National Reform Association. Now, for those of us with the familiarity as Adventists, looking at 1888 and A.T. Jones and the things that were happening in the 1888 time period. Internally in the church, there was the conflict over the latter rain message of righteousness by faith. Externally, there was, movements for a Sunday law that were then in motion. And those movements for a Sunday law were really being propelled or initiated by a particular organization. That was the National Reform Association. And they're covered extensively in this document, right? So part one looks at this 19th century movement to amend the Constitution to proclaim national devotion to Jesus Christ. As that part discusses, some evangelical Christians rejected the Constitution because they considered it a godless document that lacked any expression of religious devotion. Beginning during the Civil War and continuing through to the end of the century, they organized a national movement to make the Constitution Christian. The movement was propelled by concerns over the increasing population and power of Catholics, Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, and religious freethinkers. Increasing religious diversity generated a variety of challenges to Protestant preeminence, including objections to Christian prayers and Bible reading in public schools, Sabbath observance laws, and religious oaths. All right, so for our purposes, I'll leave it there. So what is part one covering? Part one is covering this, a movement that arose in the 19th century, proclaiming that America was a Christian nation and seeking to have this reality from their perspective immortalized within the nation's governing documents, specifically the Constitution. We will go on to see that this movement was the NRA, the National Reform Association, that A.T. Jones opposed in the 1888 time period. So that's part one. That is what is covered. If I may bring up this document again. That is what is covered here from 1863 to 1900. This is what is covered in part one of the document. Part two of the document covers this time period from 1940 to 1960. And part three, this time period from 1979 onwards. But we'll go back to the document. So part two looks at Judeo-Christian nationalism of the Eisenhower era. Like the Christian Amendment movement, religious nationalists of the 1950s understood religious devotion to be a core aspect of America's national identity, but they developed a more ecumenical rhetoric which valorized the nation's Judeo-Christian heritage rather than its Christian or specifically Protestant faith. In an effort to counter communism abroad and at home, religious nationalists of the 1950s sought ways to gain official recognition of the nation's religious identity. With little opposition, they succeeded in legislative campaigns to add "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and to adopt "In God We Trust" as the national motto. So part two is covering that history, which has been discussed, which is covered by Jonathan actually a few weeks ago in his studies on Midway and "In God We Trust." Right? The Judeo-Christian, you have a change of mindset from the thinking of the National Reform Association, which is that America is a Christian, specifically Protestant nation, right? And this reality must find expression in the nation's governing documents. When you come to the Eisenhower era of the 1960s, you see the perspective has broadened to that, America as a nation is espousing Judeo-Christian values, which is Christian in the broadest sense, right? And this framing, this perspective that America is a Christian nation, Christian in the broadest sense, this must find expression in the nation's governing documents, or the documents that set forth the nation's character. Right. So we come to part 3. It says, part 3 examines the constitutional vision of the new Christian right, the Christian conservative movement that coalesced in the 1970s, led by televangelist Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, founders of the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition. It goes on to say, the new Christian right arose to combat a perceived decline in the nation's Christian values through the acceptance of abortion rights, women's rights, gay rights, pornography, and rock music. Although the new Christian right is not ordinarily considered a constitutional movement, it had a well-developed constitutional philosophy. So you have these three movements. The National Reform Association of the 1860s to 1900s, the Judeo-Christian values movement of the 1960s onwards. Was it 1960s? 1950s onwards. Then you come to the new Christian right, which is the present manifestation, which is we can say that, which is a present, which is the contemporary manifestation of what is really the same ideology, the same mindset. So if you want to draw a line, you can trace a straight line. You could draw a thread from the National Reform Association to the Christian values movement of the 1950s to the new Christian right of today. When we say new Christian right, what are we referring to? It's the contemporary evangelical conservative Christian movement. And although the movements are different, they are fundamentally the same in terms of their thinking in key respects. How are they the same? Let me ask us that question. These are three different movements over three dispensations, but I'm saying they're the same. And I'll ask the question, how are they the same? How are these three movements the same?
Is it that their philosophy is the same? The philosophy is the same? It hasn't changed?
And what is that philosophy that hasn't changed in your own words?
Just the idea that just the Christians, the white Christians that are wanting the country of America to suit what they are expressing in their power or in their movement. So that has remained this entire time from the 50s to where we're at now. I'm not saying it properly, but that's what I think. It's somebody put in, it's the fundamental ideology. So anyways, that's their philosophy. They haven't changed from the 50s to now. Anyway, the NRA.
I think I get what you're saying, but it's as Katya said, they're all conservative and fundamentalist movements. It'd be nice if she could unpack that further. They're all conservative and fundamentalist movements. I mean, I know what that means, but it'd be nice to elaborate if you could. They have a fundamental ideology of their supremacy and their ideas of Christianity. That is another common thread, yes? And Debbie says their theology and Bible interpretations are the same. And all of that is true. What are their interpretations of the Bible which are the same? Right. I think this is a useful point to make, that we have these three dispensations over which we see these three movements. And, Goldstein is identifying a pattern that we're going to see repeating over the history of all three of these movements. And we're living through the repetition of that pattern right now at present. But in order to see a continuum from the National Reform Association to the conservative evangelical Christian movement of today, which I think we're required to see that, we're required to draw that thread, we're required to see that connection. We have to see, what the commonalities are which carry over, from the first right through to the present. Their theology and Bible interpretations are the same. Yes, you have a sort of literal face value approach to the scriptures, which promotes certain ideas, right? Which promotes certain ideas about maybe say promotes theocratic tendencies, right? David says they believe in a thus saith the Lord. And okay.
Except when it comes to the seventh-day Sabbath.
Yes, they believe in a thus saith the Lord, except when it comes to the seventh-day Sabbath. All right, but there are these commonalities that you can see in how they approach the scriptures, in some of the ideas that they are drawing from the scriptures in common, even with slight variance, but fundamentally the same idea. And in their identification of themselves as I think the term is prototypical, as the representation of Christianity and what a Christian country is supposed to look like, and so on. Some of these things are unpacked further in the document. Right, so that's definitely a useful exercise, because I think we're required to see the connection over the course of the three dispensations. Now, Goldstein makes an important point, which is that if we compare the first the first of these three dispensations, the first of these three movements, the NRA with the last, there's a key difference if we contrast them, right? He says here, if I may share the document again. All right, so Debbie's listing some of the ideas that they have there. All right, so he's
to correct me if I'm
yes,
wrong.
go ahead.
I put down post-millennialism, and as I was typing it, I was saying, oh, is that what it is? Like belief in the rapture and that, 1,000 years of peace on earth and all the interpretations they bring. Is that how it's referenced? My mind went blank.
Isn't that premillennialism?
Okay.
Where they believe the millennium happens here on earth for 1,000 years before Christ's second coming?
Yeah, and that's it.
And that's premillennialism.
Thank you. And the post-millennial is what we believe and what is biblical. Right, thank you.
Yes, that the millennium comes after the parousia or the second coming. And I think the rapture and the 1,000 years of peace on earth and so on and so forth, those are premillennial concepts in contrast to us who are, post-millennial thinking. Anyway. All right, so we said that if we compare the beginning, the first movement, with the current one, the third one, there is an important contrast in their approach and their thinking. And he points this out. He says, in contrast to the Christian Amendment movement of the 19th century, which condemned the Constitution as godless, the new Christian right insisted that the Constitution embodies Christian values and can only be understood as a charter for a Christian nation. The Constitution must be Christian, these leaders declared, because the American people are Christian. And he asked this, how did this happen? How did the godless Constitution condemned by 19th century Christian nationalists become the Constitution that more recent Christian nationalists laud as an expression of the nation's religious devotion? In short, how did the Constitution for many Americans become Christian? And this is what he is covering in this document. He's covering that all these movements view themselves as prototypically American, which means if we develop a perfect model for what an American is, they believe it's them, right? And that is being, if you look at the NRA, it is Protestant. In fact, if you look at all of them, really Protestant, patriarchal, and Caucasian, white, right? They present this, they view themselves as prototypically American, and they all seek to have this enshrined in the nation's governing documents, or the documents that set forth the nation's character. Now, the Constitution becomes a focus of the efforts of these movements, but the view or the perspective of the Constitution, how the Constitution is viewed, shifts over time. The first movement said, the Constitution is a godless document, and while God is not honored in this Constitution, while he is not explicitly given notice, while he's not specifically mentioned, and while he's not specifically set forth as the centerpiece of this document, the document is inadequate, right? It's a fundamental failure. This document is a fundamental failure. It's an aberration on account of that fact. and they sought to amend the Constitution. But now when you come to the new Christian right, they're saying that the Constitution is a Christian document and must be understood as a charter for a Christian nation. The perspective has completely changed. The fundamental fact of the Constitution being the battleground over which they're going to fight their battles over identity, that has not changed. But the view of the Constitution and how they, and subsequently how they're going to approach it and hand it, how they're going to use it, how they're going to approach it in this battle over identity, that has changed, and that's what he's covering in this document. So he asked the question, how did this happen? Jonathan says, yes, go ahead.
Suggest, you know, if we think at Israel's history, it had the same pattern. You know, before the Israelites were fighting and they were with idolatrous people and pagan and all that stuff. But after Babylon, when they came back, they said, this is not going to happen to us again. And they went very strong and say, this is our law, and we have to defend our law at any cost. It seems like the same thing is happening here in America.
You know, Claudia, I caught the tail end of your contribution, and I think it's my connection probably, but you cut out for like the first few seconds. If you wouldn't mind just, if you know, repeating your point, I think it'll be of benefit to everyone. Could you repeat it?
Okay. I was comparing, you know, the history of Israel before Babylon and after Babylon, you know, the captivity that they had. Before, they were fighting against the law of God all the time. You know, they were going into idolatry all the time. But after the captivity, after Babylon, they said, this is not going to happen to us again. And they kind of put themselves in an exclusive club, defending the law of God at any cost. And they put a lot of burdens and a lot of different little laws, because they were thinking they were doing the right thing to defend the law of God. And it seems like in America, it's happening the same thing. Now, this constitution that before, for them, it was pagan and not Christian, and now they are embracing this constitution as themselves because of the past history of, you know, the Civil War and all that, what happened. And now they want to be in an exclusive club where they want to defend the Constitution at any cost. What do you think? Did you hear me, or?
I know my connection kept cutting in and out, but I think I caught a bunch of what you were communicating. And I mean, I don't know if I have an answer to what you're saying directly, but what I will say is a definite parallel that you see is that that belief that they, you know, that they speak for God and that they represent God. You know, when I look at the New Christian right today, when I look at the New Christian right today, and when I look at the previous dispensations as well, the previous dispensations as well, from the NRA time period to the Judeo-Christian values movement to the New Christian right at present, there is this strong current of, you know, that they speak for God and that they are representing God.
Yes.
In the public discourse. Yeah. They're the Christian party in the public discourse. When, as we look at the NRA, we saw the very opposite, that they were the reasons, they were the reason why the nation was being judged. But in how it played out in the public discourse, they had the scriptures, they had the thus saith the Lord, and they were the most vocal in setting forth that claim to being on God's side and having God's approval and being his representatives in that debate. You see that in the, you know, in the Civil War time period leading up to the, you know, the NRA, which became active, you know, towards the end of the Civil War. And you see the very same thing in the New Christian right today. It is somewhat frustrating to see how, you know, the New Christian right, they have a monopoly on God.
Yes.
Right? Within the public discourse, they have the monopoly on God. You know, and, you know, if you don't support Trump, if you're not a conservative, if you're not A, B, C, and D that they subscribe to, you are not a genuine Christian. And they've been forceful and effective in forwarding that idea. They've been effective.
Yeah.
In monopolizing Christianity, and that, you know, and it's viewed to a large extent within the world space, you know, although there are other voices saying this is not genuine Christianity, this is not what real Christianity looks like, you know, but they have monopolized or cornered the market enough that they've been effective in presenting themselves as God's representatives. But just like the NRA, they are the very reason for which the nation is going to be judged.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
in another,
I think you know
that, you know, the Pharisees, when they saw Jesus Christ as a threat to them, because they were thinking they were preserving the law, and that's what they were doing, they didn't recognize Jesus Christ. And it's the same thing now, because they see as a threat whoever is going to be different and coming with different ideas.
I think you definitely see the same dynamic with the Pharisees, that they apparently had the monopoly on that claim of being God's representatives, you know, though, you know, when they were, in fact, you know, the very reason for which judgments came upon them, right? So we'll continue on, running out of time, and I just want to get to a certain part before leaving you to consider this document for yourselves, and maybe take some time to answer questions. Remember, you're free to contribute or ask your questions at any point. So, how did this happen? How did the godless constitution condemned by 19th century Christian nationalists become the constitution that more recent Christian nationalists laud as an expression of the nation's religious devotion. In short, how did the Constitution for many Americans become Christian? We need to understand this. Because if we don't understand this, we will fail to, if not correctly read present developments, we'll fail to be able to correctly explain them. It's similar to the issue of the Democrats and the Republicans. We know that in the Civil War era, the Democrats were the South and there were the slaveholders, the Republicans were the North, and there were the progressives. But today, there's been a flip, there's been a switch, right? Today, the party of racism and minority rule is the Republicans, and when I say minority rule, maybe I should clarify that. This idea that, within a couple of decades, really, America's growing increasingly diverse. Within a couple of decades, America will not be a white majority country. But they're committed to the rule of not just white people, but a specific sect of, conservative Christian people, right? Who are a minority in the country, but by various means, they've been able to exercise power beyond their actual numbers, if I may put it that way. So, we say, so in that sense, the Republicans, the party of racism and minority rule, it's now the Republicans, and the Democrats are now the pluralistic progressives. There's a history that you have to trace to be able to explain that, right? To be able to explain what happened, not only understand what happened, but to explain it. It's the same thing here. We need to be able to trace that history to understand how did that, this switch take place in the Christian nationalists from the 19th century to the present. He says, the answer lies in America's constitutional culture, which transforms disputes over national identity into constitutional disputes. Despite their differences, the three movements examined here, the Christian Amendment movement of the 19th century, the Judeo-Christian nationalism of the mid-20th century, and the new Christian right of the late 20th century, each followed a similar pattern. For time, I'll just go on. He covers this pattern. This pattern you see laid out in the diagram. The pattern that you see fulfilled in each of these dispensations is, the first is, this concept of a group threat. You have a group of people who view themselves as prototypically American. They are the prototype, they are the model. They view themselves as prototypically American, but then they are minorities who are perceived to be growing, if not in numbers, in influence. And this growth in influence leads this group of people who view themselves as prototypically American, it leads them to view these minorities as a threat. Right, that's what this group threat concept is. And this group threat is followed by a response in a nationalist framework. A response in a nationalist framework. And this is where members of the movement, right, of the prototypically, those who consider themselves prototypically Americans, members of the movement considered religious identity to be a core national trait and therefore understood threats to their religious status as attacks on America itself. Right. So these people view themselves as prototypically American, and they view their religion as not just their religion, but the religion of the nation. They view their religion as a national trait. So they view the threat of these minorities, right, as not threats to themselves or to their religion, but they view it as threats to the nation more broadly. Okay, so the group threat is followed by a response in a nationalist framework, which is followed by constitutional demands. So because this group views the threat to them, to their religion, as a threat to the national identity more broadly, they look to the Constitution. They respond to what they see as an attack on the nation's religious identity by making demands to amend or interpret the Constitution to entrench that identity. I'll say that again, right? So they perceive a group threat, a threat to their group, whether it's a religious minority or an ethnic minority. And they view the threat to themselves, they view the challenge to themselves by this religious minority or this ethnic minority, they view it as a threat to the nation itself. And their response is to make constitutional demands. It is to respond to what they see as an attack on their religious identity. They respond by making demands to amend or interpret the Constitution to entrench their identity. So this is a pattern that you see repeated, right? So I'm going to come to this diagram, and I'll share this diagram with you. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to ask a really quick question. Is this the Sunday law that we're expecting in the near future? This, the threat that you've just expressed deeply multiple times over, the threat that they feel for themselves, and they have to fight for what they think is right. Is that what the Sunday law is going to be? Because I mean, I've been listening to these studies and hearing this history like you guys for a long time now, but I haven't identified exactly what the Sunday law per se is 100%. So I'm just asking if this is what it is, that they want to defend themselves against this threat, that they don't want the minorities or minority groups or other religious groups to infringe upon their constitutional rights.
Yeah, it's not the Sunday law, but it is the mentality that is driving the response, or rather, let me say it this way. It is the mentality that is going to drive them to pass the Sunday law, whatever the Sunday law is. This is the mentality and the thinking that is leading to it.
So we don't know exactly what the Sunday law is then at this point, do we?
No, we just know it deals with the subject of equality.
Equality, yes. Okay, thank you very much.
Right. It fundamentally deals with the issue of equality, but what the specific thing is, that has not been opened up to us. Its character is what is being opened up to us now. I'd like to take the remaining time we have left just to narrate, because in this document we've literally just gone through the introduction. That's all we've covered. One page 7 of a 51-page document, just the introduction. And now I just want to narrate what he lays out in the rest of the document, which is what we have here in this diagram. So from 1863 to 1900, you have the Protestants, right? You have the Protestants, conservative Protestants, establishing the National Reform Association. Now, he makes reference specifically to the Presbyterians and the role of that fundamentalist and the role of that sect of the Presbyterians referred to as the Covenanters. He makes reference to them specifically, and they're significant because they're covered elsewhere. They're covered in other histories, in other documents that Elder Tess has shared with us, right? The Covenanters, I was about to make reference to a book, but for time's sake, I'll continue. So you have these people, mobilizing, right? Through this National Reform Association, mobilizing for the purpose of putting a Christian amendment, making a Christian amendment to the Constitution, right? Passing a Christian amendment. But why were they mobilizing? What galvanized them? Goldstein highlights that Catholics and Jews, these were new immigrant groups that were coming into the country in large numbers. Then you had new religious denominations that had come into being, such as Seventh-day Adventists. And you have other philosophical persuasions like the free thinkers. Now, these groups challenged the monolithic view of the monolithic view of society, of what it was to be American, that these fundamentalist Protestants had, right? They began to argue for pluralism. They argued for separation of church and state, because if you're going to be teaching, Bible in the schools, well, as a Seventh-day Adventist, I don't subscribe to your teaching of the Bible, so separation of church and state, let's have the Bible out of there altogether, right? They saw the growing influence of these groups, and they saw them as a threat. They looked at the Constitution, right? And their perception was the lack of religious language in the Constitution threatened the nation's identity as a Protestant and Christian nation. And they responded by proposing the Christian Amendment to adopt religious language in the Constitution. Now, the Christian Amendment, as Elder Tess has pointed out, that was their main thing. The Sunday law was a footnote. She used that expression. It was a footnote. It was, related, but it wasn't the main thing that they were pushing for in that time period, right? But the movement essentially petered out, and it lost influence and failed. They did have some successes that Goldstein covers in the document, but they failed of their ultimate goal of amending the Constitution. Now we come to the Judeo-Christian values movement of the 1950s. This is the Cold War time. This is when communism is rising. You have the rise of communism and the specter of, the godless atheism that came with communism, right? And this is within the context of the Cold War. This existential clash of civilizations. And you also have these Jewish groups, these civil libertarians who are still arguing for pluralism, for, the removal of religious symbols in no school prayer and so on and so forth, and these are viewed as a threat, right? The removal of religious practice in schools threatened their national identity. That was one of the galvanizing issues for the Judeo-Christian values movement. And their constitutional response was to forward the school prayer amendment. The school prayer amendment failed. It was not passed, right? So they failed of their goal of having the constitutional amendment. Now you come to the new Christian right, who see a group threat in secular humanists, the left, the liberals, right? They view these as an existential threat to the nation, as well as the immigrants, ethnic minorities, and right. And the issue that galvanized them was Brown versus Board of Education. Because their conception of their Christian nation was white and patriarchal, the decision to desegregate the schools for them was, it was intolerable. And that was the issue that galvanized the new Christian right. And that has brought us to the present. Right, Goldstein makes mention of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and the role that they played in this movement. Now, their constitutional response is different. In character with everything in this dispensation, as Elder Tess has covered, that it's more subtle. It's not in your face, it's more subtle. They're not demanding that the Constitution be amended outright. Their demand is that the Constitution be interpreted to protect the nation's Christian identity. They're not trying to amend the Constitution. They're trying to determine or control how it is interpreted. And how they interpret it is, originalism. There's a line of constitutional scholarship and thinking referred to as originalism, which is that the Constitution should be interpreted in the way that the founding fathers, those who framed it, understood it. Which is problematic because the founding fathers did not view women as equal. They did not view people of color as full human beings. They did not recognize the rights of these people, right? And so on. So that becomes very problematic. But that is the line of thought, that the Constitution should be interpreted a certain way. We're not trying to amend it. We're going to tell you how to read it properly. So we can compare and contrast this with the three dispensations of modern Israel, where we know the first in the Millerites was a failure. The second in the 1888 time period was a failure. But the third, right, from 1989 onwards, our dispensation is going to succeed. We see the same thing in the three dispensations of this Christian nationalist movement. The first failed, the second failed, but this third is succeeding and is going to succeed. So I'm going to share this this diagram with you, so you can I'm going to stop sharing now. Okay, I'm just going to paste this diagram for you. While I do that, do I have any, we've just given an overview, and do we have any thoughts or contributions before we close?
I have a
In the
question.
third group.
Oh, never mind. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Ali. I was just going to say, Elder Tabo, in the third group, the 1970s on, secular humanists as the group threat, I would throw in there socialists, and even perhaps to a more subtle way, communists as well still. And the reason I suggest socialists is this whole, you know, the fear of Cuba, the fear of Russia, the fear of China, and the fear of socialism encroaching into the American ethic, which in many ways was manifest more strongly in the, you know, Bernie Sanders and even Elizabeth Warren, and the Fave Four, you know, AOC and etc., being viewed by many, I'll say mainstream Christians, but we could certainly reference Trump's base in particular. But I mean, they were basically labeled socialists and sort of that thrust. And that didn't come out of thin air. It didn't come out of a vacuum. It's a progressive growth through the fear of secular humanism in the 70s and 80s, but lingering in the background was still this fear of communism and socialism, and in a sense almost any ism other than Americanism. But so I would say it's a little different than just secular humanism, and maybe a little more subtle, but I would say it would qualify as a portion of the group threat still for that third group.
Okay, thanks for that, David. David is asking, are evangelicals the ones who are going to pass the Sunday law? Well, when we say evangelicals, I think in summary, yes. The new Christian right, this political movement that is driven by, you know, this conservative evangelical base, you know, they're the ones who are going to pass the Sunday law. They're the ones who are going to be responsible for it. They failed in previous dispensations, but in this one they will succeed.
What are your thoughts?
Or at least that's what are my thoughts?
What are your thoughts on, like, the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act was done by, or the design of it anyway was done by Henry Clay, who was in that time a liberal, and it was a compromise. And the Sunday law in 1888 was also a compromise done by the liberals in that time. William Blair, or was it William Blair, I think, or Henry Blair, whatever his name was, who wrote the Blair Bills. He was actually part of the Liberal Party, from what I understand. He was a Republican in 1888, so he would have been liberal. So I thought that I was confused on that subject, because I thought that I always thought it was the evangelicals, but it seems that the histories show that it's something that's done by the liberals as a compromise. But I don't know if that's correct or not.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. I mean, you're reminding me of that point. And I think it's something to look at more closely. I won't pretend to fully understand it at present. Because that is true. I mean, it is true that you know, when you look at the role of you know, Henry Clay and so on in the crafting of the Fugitive Slave Act, we know it was driven by the South, but you know, the North compromised with it and assented to put it in place, right?
Right.
So I mean, that's an important point. Yeah, I mean, thank you for making that point, which is when we come to our time, it's quite it would be correct to say that the evangelicals are the ones driving it, you know.
Yeah, well, they're
the driving force behind it.
They're the ones that are making the demands.
Yes, yeah, in that sense, right? But in terms of who frames the law and who passes it, you know, it may not follow, again, based on the histories that have been, it may not follow that it'll just be them, right? It may be a combination of their push and liberal compromise.
Right. It was to preserve the Union back then, which would be, you could see that happening again today, where they're focused on unity at almost any cost. And it's about bringing the country together to preserve essentially the empire. Constantine was the same thing. When he had passed the Sunday law in his time, it was to bring the Christians and the pagans together, and it was a compromise to do that. And he was doing it for the empire of Rome. Right.
You know, Jonathan, I certainly was thinking along that same line a while back, but possibly somebody else other than me heard, I don't think it was one of the Australian, well, for us, Friday afternoon, you know, Sabbath meetings, but it wasn't this most recent camp either, but I thought I heard Elder Tess either answer a comment in the chat or in reference to something that I think wasn't just initiated by her. She made some reference to 2024. And from what I remember, I thought I heard her say Republicans would be back in power, or I can't quite remember, so I shouldn't really say anything too definitely or definitively, but and as soon as she said that, I was thinking in terms of that compromise, you know, Jonathan, just what you've been describing would still pertain, because Democrats, and again, after all of this horrific bipartisanship over the last 4 years and continuing now and probably through the next 4 years, it may be at a place where Democrats are willing to compromise with Republicans and in that sense bring about, like, not the Democrats driving it, but the Republicans driving it and the Democrats compromising and bringing it about. Anyway, just a thought based on something that I seem to recollect or Elder Tess has said.
I mean, it's a valid, I mean, it's an important thought. Thanks for that, Debbie. Brethren, we're over time. I'd like to close with a word of prayer, and you know, if folks want to stay on to discuss afterwards, that's okay. But I'd just like to close to respect the time. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for the ground we've been able to cover. And we thank you for this increase of knowledge that you're opening to our understanding. Please help us individually and as a body to settle into it. Please be in our respective households. Please bless us. And may you continue to bless these Thursday studies. Bless all who come and help us to be ready for Pentecost. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.